I came home for the Christmas holiday, expecting the usual tense family dinner, but the house was completely dark and silent. I found my mother gasping for air on the living room floor, struggling through a massive heart attack. Next to her lay a handwritten note from my father, stating that he and my sister had gone to Hawaii because they could not get a refund on a Michelin star restaurant reservation. He wrote that my mother was just being dramatic and told me to stay and take care of her as the paramedics rushed her away. My mother grabbed my hand and whispered a request to help her teach them a lesson. I nodded and promised I would. 1 week later, when they finally came home, they walked into a nightmare they never saw coming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace. Now, let me tell you exactly how I burned their perfect world to the ground and took back everything they stole. The heavy oak front door of our family estate in Atlanta swung open to absolute silence. It was Christmas Eve, and this house was usually blazing with lights and packed with catering staff, preparing for the legendary holiday parties my father Marcus loved to host. I am Camille, and at 32 years old, I work as a real estate portfolio manager in Chicago. I took the red-eye flight down just to make an appearance to play my role as the reliable but boring older daughter in our affluent African-American family. I dropped my luggage in the grand foyer, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. The house was freezing cold, as if the heating system had been completely shut off to save money for their extravagant trip. No holiday music played in the background to welcome me home. No smells of roasting meats or expensive wine lingered in the air. The grand crystal chandelier was turned off, leaving the hallway submerged in heavy shadows and eerie silence. I called out into the darkness, expecting my younger sister, Jasmine, to complain about my loud voice ruining her peaceful evening beauty routine. Nobody answered me. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears as I walked further into the massive living room, my heels clicking loudly against the polished marble floor. That is when I heard a terrifying sound. It was a wet, desperate wheezing noise coming from the area near the large stone fireplace. I dropped my heavy leather purse and ran across the room. My mother, Evelyn, was crumpled on the expensive Persian rug. Her hands were clawing frantically at her chest, and her face was a terrifying shade of ashen gray. Her eyes were wide with a deep panic I had never seen before. She was gasping heavily, pulling at the collar of her silk blouse, trying to drag air into lungs that were rapidly failing her. I screamed for her, falling to my knees right beside her on the floor. Her skin was clammy and freezing cold to the touch. Her lips were turning a frightening shade of blue. I immediately recognized the obvious signs of a massive and severe heart attack. I grabbed her shoulders, trying to prop her up slightly so she could breathe easier. She tried to speak to me, but only a strangled gargle came out of her throat. I yelled out into the empty house, demanding to know where everyone was. I looked around the dark room, trying to figure out how long she had been lying here alone on the cold floor. I ripped my phone from my coat pocket and dialed emergency services, my fingers shaking so badly I almost dropped the device on the marble tiles. As the phone rang endlessly in my ear, my eyes darted to the glass coffee table situated just above us. There was a half-empty glass of water spilled across a neat stack of architectural magazines. Right beside it, weighed down by a heavy crystal coaster, was a piece of thick, customized stationery. I grabbed the paper while the emergency dispatcher finally answered the line. The handwriting clearly belonged to my father, Marcus. The words written on that paper hit me much harder than any physical blow ever could have. Your father and sister went to Hawaii. Bradley booked a Michelin star restaurant months ago, and we could not get a refund on the deposit. Stay here and take care of your mother. Do not be dramatic because she is just tired. I read the cruel words again and again, my brain completely refusing to process the sheer audacity and selfishness of the message. My mother was literally dying on the floor, and my father had casually stepped over her body to catch a flight to a tropical island paradise. He had packed his bags, grabbed his golf clubs, and taken Jasmine, his precious golden child, and her arrogant white husband Bradley, on a luxury vacation, leaving his wife of 35 years to suffocate in an empty mansion. He knew she was terribly unwell because she had been complaining of chest pains for weeks. The spilled glass of water proved he had seen her struggling to breathe and reach for her medication. He simply decided that a non-refundable dinner reservation and a week of sipping drinks by the ocean was vastly more valuable than her life. The dispatcher's loud voice snapped me back to reality, asking for my exact location. I shouted our home address, giving rapid details about my mother's deteriorating condition. My father had always been a man dangerously obsessed with his public image, prioritizing his country club status over his actual family. But this was a level of monstrous neglect I had never anticipated from him. He had explicitly instructed me not to be dramatic, casually dismissing a fatal cardiac event as mere exhaustion just so he could enjoy his expensive vacation without an ounce of guilt. He had calculated the timing perfectly, knowing my flight from Chicago landed tonight, assuming I would eventually walk in and handle his mess, just like I always did for them. I looked down at my mother, whose eyes were rolling back into her head, her grip on my arm weakening by the second. I threw the hateful note aside and quickly positioned my hands over the center of her chest. I locked my elbows and began chest compressions, praying to God. I was not too late to save the only person in this toxic house who had ever shown me genuine, unconditional kindness. 1, 2, 3, 4, I counted out loud, pressing down hard on her fragile rib cage with all my body weight. The emergency dispatcher stayed on the speakerphone, guiding my rhythm and promising that help was quickly on the way. With every frantic compression, a lifetime of toxic family history flashed through my mind like a terrible cinematic movie. I pushed down and remembered my father loudly telling our extended relatives at a summer barbecue that my career managing real estate portfolios was completely unglamorous and masculine compared to Jasmine's beautiful life as a wealthy socialite. I pushed again and thought of Bradley, my entitled white brother-in-law, who paraded around town as the chief financial officer of our family company, despite having zero actual qualifications for the high-paying job. I thought about how Bradley looked down his nose at me at every Thanksgiving dinner, making snide, arrogant remarks about my practical clothes and my single status, telling me I needed to smile more and work less. I breathed air into my mother's lungs and begged her to stay with me to keep fighting against the darkness. For as long as I could remember, this family had operated on a brutal and unfair emotional hierarchy. Jasmine was the beautiful social butterfly who could absolutely do no wrong in their eyes. She spent her days shopping for expensive designer bags, planning lavish parties, and posting perfectly curated photos, online funding her extravagant lifestyle entirely through my parents' bank accounts. Marcus, my father, completely worshipped the ground she walked on, treating her like royalty. He treated Bradley like the successful, brilliant son he never had, handing him a 6-figure executive title just for marrying into our family. And me, I was always the designated scapegoat. I was the uninteresting, practical workaholic who was only summoned when something major needed fixing or financing. When Jasmine wrecked her luxury car driving recklessly, I was the one who handled the complicated insurance claims so her rates would not increase. When my father needed legal documents untangled for his shady property deals, he sent them to my corporate office in Chicago, expecting free expert labor. I was their personal family crisis manager, expected to solve every single problem, while receiving absolutely zero respect or gratitude in return. But my mother, Evelyn, had always been the silent, long-suffering victim in Marcus Grand's play for societal dominance. She came from a highly prominent African-American family in Atlanta, bringing massive generational wealth and old money status to their marriage. Marcus had married her solely to elevate his own social standing and gain access to her trust fund. For decades, she had kept the peace, swallowing her pride, and enduring his narcissistic behavior just to maintain the perfect public illusion of a happy, successful family. She had surrendered her power and her voice to keep us together, and this was her ultimate reward, being left to die on a rug while her husband and favorite daughter flew first class to Maui to drink cocktails on the beach. The loud, piercing sound of approaching sirens finally broke through my racing thoughts. The heavy thud of heavy boots pounded onto the front porch. The front door burst open, and a team of paramedics rushed into the living room, pushing me aside so they could take over the life-saving measures. I scrambled to my feet, backing away into the shadows as they hooked her up to various medical monitors and began preparing the defibrillator machine. One of the medics shouted a warning, and my mother's body jolted violently on the floor. I stood trembling in the corner of my childhood home, clutching my father's handwritten note tightly in my fist. The thick paper crinkled under my tight grip as profound anger replaced my fear. The paramedics worked with frantic precision, shouting complex medical terms, calling out her rapidly dropping vital signs. The lead paramedic announced they needed to move her immediately if she was going to survive. They lifted her limp body onto the stretcher, strapping her down tightly as a plastic oxygen mask was secured over her face. I grabbed my winter coat and followed them out into the freezing December night air. As they loaded her into the back of the brightly lit ambulance, I climbed in right beside her, refusing to let her go alone. The heavy doors slammed shut, and the loud siren wailed as we sped through the dark suburban streets heading toward the nearest hospital emergency room. I looked down at my mother's pale face, which was illuminated by the harsh, flashing red and white lights of the ambulance interior. She was barely holding on to life. I smoothed her hair back from her forehead, my heart breaking completely for the woman who had sacrificed everything she had for a family that viewed her as entirely disposable. In that cramped speeding vehicle, holding the cold hand of the mother who had been discarded for a dinner reservation, something fundamental inside my soul shifted permanently. The beautiful, obedient daughter, who always cleaned up their messes, died right there in the back of that ambulance. The deep sadness I felt was quickly replaced by a fierce rage that was cold, calculating, and absolute. I smoothed out the crumpled note, staring at the cruel words Marcus had written. He had asked me to stay and take care of his mess. I fully intended to grant his wish, but I was going to handle it my own way. I was going to tear down the entire fake empire he and Bradley had built on my mother back. I was going to ensure that when they finally returned from their luxury island vacation, they would come back to absolutely nothing but the severe consequences of their own actions. I would make them pay for every tear my mother ever shed. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room buzzed relentlessly above my head, casting a pale, sickly glow over the sterile white walls. I paced back and forth across the scuffed linoleum floor, my boots echoing in the quiet corridor. The smell of bleach and antiseptic stung my nose, a constant bitter reminder of the fragile line between life and death. My mother was somewhere behind those heavy double doors, fighting for every single breath, while a team of doctors worked frantically to stabilize her failing heart. I clutched my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. My chest was tight with a mixture of profound terror and a boiling, consuming rage that I had never experienced before. I looked down at the screen, staring at my father's contact name. I was supposed to be her partner, her protector, the man who vowed to stand by her in sickness and in health. Instead, he had stepped over her collapsing body to catch a flight to paradise. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands, and hit the call button. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the long, agonizing rings as it connected across the ocean to Hawaii. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. I was almost certain he was going to send me straight to voicemail. But finally, the line clicked open. Instantly, a wave of loud, obnoxious noise assaulted my ear. I could hear the upbeat rhythmic strumming of a ukulele, a pulsing bass line from a live band, and the deafening chatter of a crowded, lively party. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the booming sound of raucous laughter echoed through the receiver. It was a luau, a lavish tropical celebration happening while my mother was flatlining in an emergency room. "What do you want, Camille?" My father snapped, his voice dripping with intense irritation. He sounded out of breath, likely from mingling and laughing just seconds before picking up my call. "I told you to handle things at the house. Do not tell me you are calling because you cannot figure out how to give your mother her medication. Dad, you need to listen to me." I started, my voice trembling slightly as I tried to project over the loud tropical music playing in his background. "Mom is not just tired. She had a massive heart attack. I found her unconscious on the living room floor. She is in the intensive care unit right now, and the doctors are saying it is critical. You need to get on the next flight back to Atlanta immediately." There was a brief pause on the line, but it was not the stunned silence of a grieving, heartbroken husband. It was the annoyed huff of a man whose perfect evening was being inconveniently interrupted. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Camille," he groaned loudly, completely dismissing the gravity of my words. "Are you seriously doing this right now? You are blowing things entirely out of proportion, just like you always do. Your mother has been complaining about indigestion all week. It is just acid reflux and a little bit of stress. She is faking a crisis because she is upset that we did not bring her along on this trip. I am not falling for her manipulative guilt trips, and I am certainly not letting you ruin this evening." I stopped pacing and stood frozen in the middle of the hospital hallway. The sheer audacity of his denial left me completely speechless. "I'm at the hospital with her right now," I insisted, gripping the phone tighter. "The paramedics had to use a defibrillator to shock her heart back into a normal rhythm. She almost died on our living room rug while you were boarding your first-class flight. This is not a game. I do not have time for your dramatic nonsense." My father hissed his tone, dropping into a vicious, low whisper. Do you have any idea how important tonight is? Bradley pulled a lot of strings to secure us a table at this exclusive networking event. He has introduced me to 3 major real estate developers from Tokyo tonight. These are people who can elevate our company portfolio to the next level. Bradley went out of his way to arrange these introductions, and I am not going to embarrass him or myself by running away because your mother wants some attention. The mention of Bradley made my blood boil. Bradley was my younger sister, arrogant white husband, who paraded around with a chief financial officer title at our family company, despite having 0 qualifications. He was a smooth-talking country club elitist who spent his days playing golf and his nights draining our company accounts to fund his luxury lifestyle. And yet my father worshipped him, viewing him as the ultimate status symbol for our affluent African Amiyan family. You care more about Bradley networking event than your own wife dying? I shouted, no longer caring if the nurses at the nearby station were staring at me. You need to come home right now. Before my father could respond, I heard a scuffle over the line. The phone was being snatched away. A second later, the shrill, slurred voice of my younger sister, Jasmine, pierced through the speaker. She was clearly intoxicated, her words blending together with the sloppy confidence of someone drinking expensive champagne all afternoon. Camille, seriously, what is your problem? Jasmine whined loudly over the music. Can you please stop being so miserable for just one single night? You are literally ruining my vacation. Jasmine, you need to tell Dad to book a flight, I pleaded, trying to cut through her drunken haze. Mom had a heart attack. Oh my gosh, you are so annoying. Jasmine groaned, letting out a dramatic sigh. Bradley dropped $50,000 on this trip for us. $50,000? Camille, do you know how hard it was to get these reservations? But of course, you have to call and start drama because you are jealous that you are stuck in freezing Atlanta with your boring life while we are out here living our best lives in paradise. She is in the emergency room, I screamed, my voice echoing off the hospital walls. Her heart stopped beating. Jasmine. She was clinically dead on the floor. The doctors are trying to save her life right now. You are such a liar, Jasmine scoffed, her voice dripping with pure condescension. Mom is just throwing a tantrum for attention because we left without her. She knew Bradley booked this trip months ago and she is just acting out to punish us. Just give her a glass of water and tell her to go to sleep. We are busy networking with actual important people. Do not call this number again until we are back on Wednesday. The line went completely dead. A loud clicking sound echoed in my ear, followed by the dial tone. They had actually hung up on me. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I stared at the blank screen for a long time, trying to comprehend the sheer level of sociopathic entitlement I had just witnessed. My mother was fighting for her life in a room just a few feet away from me, and her husband and youngest daughter had hung up the phone because her death was inconvenient to their luxury vacation schedule. They had chosen a $50,000 trip and a fancy dinner with Bradley over her survival. A profound, chilling silence settled over my soul. The shock and panic that had been driving me for the past 2 hours completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cold, hardened resolve. I realized in that exact moment that the family I thought I knew did not exist. They were not just selfish or out of touch. They were toxic parasites who viewed my mother and me as nothing more than disposable assets designed to serve their needs. Miss Camille. Camille. A soft voice broke through my thoughts. I turned to see a doctor standing in the doorway of the intensive care unit. He looked exhausted, but offered a small, reassuring nod. We have managed to stabilize her, he said, his voice gentle. It was a massive cardiac event, and her heart sustained significant stress. But she is a fighter. She has regained consciousness. She is incredibly weak and needs to rest, but she is asking for you. I thanked him quickly and followed him through the swinging doors into the intensive care unit. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of several complex medical monitors surrounding her bed. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the quiet space, tracking the fragile, steady beats of her restored heart. I walked to the side of the bed and looked down at my mother. Evelyn looked so small and fragile, her dark skin pale against the stark white hospital sheets. Several intravenous lines were connected to her arms, delivering life-saving medications into her bloodstream. A clear plastic oxygen mask covered her nose and mouth, fogging up slightly with every shallow breath she took. I pulled a plastic chair close to the bed and sat down gently, taking her cold hand in mine. I expected to see fear or confusion in her eyes, I expected to see the familiar, tired resignation of a woman who had spent decades tolerating abuse to keep the peace. Instead, when her eyes fluttered open and focused on my face, I saw something entirely different. There were no tears. There was no panic. Her dark eyes were filled with a terrifying cold clarity. It was a sharp, piercing awareness that sent a shiver straight down my spine. The obedient, quiet society wife, who had always smiled through the pain, was completely gone. The woman looking back at me had crossed the threshold of death and returned with absolute certainty, slowly with trembling but deliberate fingers. My mother reached up and pulled the elastic strap of the oxygen mask over her head. She lowered the plastic mask down to her chin, ignoring the soft warning beep from the nearby machine. "Mom, please leave the mask on. You need to rest," I whispered, trying to gently guide her hand back up. She tightened her grip on my fingers, stopping my movement. Her grasp was surprisingly strong for someone who had just survived a fatal event. "Did you call them?" she asked, her voice nothing more than a dry, raspy whisper, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. I swallowed hard, not wanting to cause her any more stress, but knowing she demanded the truth. "Yes, I called them. Dad and Jasmine," they answered. "But they said they are staying in Hawaii. They think you are faking it for attention." My mother did not flinch. She did not cry. A humorless ghost of a smile touched the corners of her dry lips. "I spent 35 years playing the obedient, silent wife," she whispered, her voice steady and chillingly calm. 35 years shrinking myself down, swallowing my pride, hiding my brilliance just to protect your father. Fragile ego in this community. I gave him everything. I let him pretend he built this empire from nothing. I let him parade around Atlanta like a king, using my family money to fund his delusions of grandeur. I tolerated his arrogance. I tolerated that wretched, arrogant boy, Bradley, draining our accounts to buy Jasmine affection. I did it all because I thought maintaining the illusion of a perfect family was the right thing to do. She paused, taking a shallow, ragged breath, her eyes never leaving mine. And my reward for 35 years of absolute devotion was being left to die on a rug. While they rushed to catch a flight, she continued, her voice hardening with every syllable. "They stepped over my body, Camille. They looked at me, struggling to breathe, and they chose a dinner reservation over my life." I felt hot tears pricking the corners of my eyes as I listened to her. I squeezed her hand, trying to offer whatever comfort I could. "We are going to get through this, Mom. You just need to focus on healing right now." "I am healed," she whispered, her eyes burning with a fierce, unyielding intensity. "I have never seen things more clearly than I do right now. They left me to die, Camille. They threw me away because I became an inconvenience to their lifestyle." She squeezed my hand again, pulling me slightly closer to her face. "Will you help me teach them a lesson?" she asked, her voice dropping into a low, deadly, serious tone that left no room for doubt or hesitation. I looked down at the woman who had sacrificed her entire existence for a family of narcissistic parasites. I thought about the cruel, dismissive laughter I had heard over the phone just minutes ago. I thought about the $50,000 vacation funded by her generational wealth. While she lay dying alone in a cold, dark house, I wiped the tears from my face and looked directly into my mother's eyes, matching her cold, fierce clarity with my own. "Yes, Mom," I whispered, making a vow that would permanently alter the course of our entire family history. "I will help you tear their whole world apart." My mother nodded once, a silent confirmation of our new alliance. She pulled the oxygen mask back up over her face, closed her eyes, and let her breathing fall into a slow, steady rhythm. The game had officially changed. They thought they had left behind a dramatic nuisance, but they had actually awakened a sleeping giant. The obedient mother and the beautiful scapegoat daughter were gone. We were going to dismantle their perfect lives brick by brick, and we were going to enjoy every single second of it. I left the hospital parking lot in a complete daze. The freezing Atlanta wind bit harshly at my face, but I barely felt the cold against my skin. My mind was entirely consumed by the heavy vow I had just made to my mother as she lay in that intensive care bed. I drove through the dark, empty streets, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles cramped and ached. The suburban roads were lined with elaborate flashing Christmas light displays, mocking the absolute darkness and misery of my own family reality. When I finally pulled into the massive circular driveway of our gated estate, the house loomed before me like a giant empty tomb. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and stepped back into the freezing foyer. The silence of the mansion was no longer just eerie and uncomfortable. It felt suffocating and heavy, with decades of toxic secrets and unspoken resentments. I walked past the main living room, deliberately avoiding looking at the expensive Persian rug where my mother had nearly lost her life just a few short hours ago. The stain of the spilled water glass was still there, next to the cruel note my father had abandoned. I refused to let the tears fall again. I marched straight up the grand sweeping staircase, heading directly for the one room in the house I had always been strictly forbidden to enter without a formal invitation. Marcus kept his home office locked, like a maximum security fortress. It was his ultimate sanctuary of power and fragile ego. I used the emergency master key my mother had told me about to click the heavy oak door open. I flipped the brass light switch, illuminating a room that perfectly encapsulated my father and his arrogant vanity. The walls were paneled in expensive dark cherry wood that smelled faintly of expensive cigars and leather. Framed magazine covers featuring Marcus smiling, fake confident smiles hung perfectly straight on every available surface. There were dozens of photos scattered across the room showing him golfing with important local politicians or posing on luxury yachts with Jasmine and Bradley. There was not a single picture of my mother anywhere in sight. It was as if she did not even exist in his highly curated version of reality. I walked past his massive oak desk, ignoring the expensive leather executive chair he loved to spin around in while lecturing me about my supposed life failures. My mother had given me very specific and urgent instructions before I left her hospital bedside. I walked toward the back of the room, where a massive floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelf covered the entire back wall. The tall shelves were filled with heavy leather-bound volumes on business strategy and corporate law that I knew Marcus had never actually bothered to read. They were just expensive decorative props for his elaborate daily stage play to impress his wealthy friends. I grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden structure. My mother had told me about a hidden mechanical latch located just behind the third shelf on the left side. I reached my hand into the narrow, dusty gap, feeling around blindly in the dark until my fingers brushed against a small, cold metal lever. I pushed down hard and heard a satisfying mechanical click echo loudly through the quiet room. I braced my boots against the thick wool carpet and pulled the heavy mahogany bookshelf toward me with all my strength. It swung open smoothly on hidden industrial hinges, revealing a dark, recessed cavity built directly into the wall. Tucked inside the deep shadows was a massive steel wall safe. This was not the standard digital combination safe Marcus kept in his master bedroom to hold his expensive watches and extra cash. This was an antique heavy-duty vault with a complex mechanical dial that looked like it belonged in a bank. Marcus had lived in this house for over 20 years and had absolutely no idea this safe even existed behind his precious unread books. It belonged entirely to my mother and her generational family trust, having been installed by her grandfather long before Marcus ever stepped foot in the city of Atlanta. I reached out and touched the cold metal dial, feeling a rush of adrenaline pump through my veins. My mother had memorized the combination decades ago and managed to whisper the numbers to me in the emergency room despite her weakness. 3 turns to the right, stopping exactly on 42. 2 turns to the left, stopping precisely on 17. 1 final full turn to the right, landing squarely on 55. I grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled downward with a sharp tug. The internal locking mechanism released with a heavy metallic thud that sounded incredibly loud in the silent, empty mansion. The thick steel door swung outward, revealing rows of tightly packed legal documents, thick manila folders, and heavy leather-bound financial ledgers that held the true hidden history of our entire family. I reached into the dark cavity of the safe and pulled out a stack of the heavy ledgers, carrying them over to Marcus' pristine oak desk. I swept his scattered golf magazines and expensive fountain pens onto the floor, not caring at all as they clattered against the hardwood. I dropped the heavy books onto the smooth surface and opened the very first folder. I am a senior real estate portfolio manager. I handle hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial assets every single day for my corporate clients up in Chicago. Analyzing complex financial documents, tracing obscure asset histories, and spotting hidden market trends is not just my daily job. It is my absolute unmatched expertise. Marcus had always belittled my career, calling it a glorified clerical role for boring people without real business vision. I was about to find out just how dangerously wrong he was about the daughter he always pushed aside. The first document I examined was the original incorporation charter for our family real estate empire. I scanned the faded typewritten pages from decades ago, and a bitter, humorless laugh escaped my throat. For my entire life, Marcus had paraded around Atlanta, boasting about how he built his massive company from the ground up through sheer grit and his unmatched business brilliance. He told everyone who would listen at his country club that he was a self-made king who dragged himself out of poverty to conquer the local real estate market. The fragile paper sitting in front of me proved that his entire existence was a carefully constructed, pathetic lie. The company was actually founded in 1968 by my great-grandfather, a brilliant and ruthless African-American businessman who had quietly acquired massive tracts of highly valuable commercial land across the entire state. The real estate empire was already fully built, highly profitable, and entirely self-sustaining long before Marcus even met my mother. Marcus did not build a single thing in his entire life. He had simply married a wealthy, grieving A's, manipulated his way into the executive chair, and slapped his own arrogant name on the corporate letterhead to feed his delusion. He was nothing but a charming, smooth-talking fraud who had hijacked another man's legacy to feed his own insatiable, endless ego. But the sickening lies did not stop at stolen glory. I opened the more recent financial ledgers and printed bank statements my mother had secretly been compiling over the last 3 years. She had suspected something was deeply wrong, but did not have the formal financial background to prove her theories. She just knew the math was not adding up when she looked at the household budgets. I spread the quarterly financial reports across the large desk, pulling a red pen from my pocket to track the flowing numbers line by line. It took my professionally trained eyes less than 20 minutes to spot the massive, glaring discrepancies hidden within the complex corporate spreadsheets. Bradley, my golden boy brother-in-law, had been appointed as the chief financial officer of the company, entirely based on Marcus' glowing recommendation. I was supposedly a financial genius who was expanding our portfolio into new, modern, profitable markets. The truth hiding in these physical documents was far more sinister and disgusting. Bradley was orchestrating a massive, sophisticated embezzlement scheme right under the noses of the sleeping corporate board members. I traced a series of massive wire transfers labeled as commercial property acquisitions in the Cayman Islands and vague corporate consulting fees. There were no new commercial properties being acquired anywhere. There were no actual consulting firms providing any legitimate services to our business. The money was being systematically drained directly from my mother-generational trust fund and funneled straight into offshore private bank accounts controlled exclusively by Bradley and Marcus. They were bleeding the company completely dry month after month. The deeper I dug into the transaction histories, the more nauseating the reality became. They were stealing millions of dollars to fund their lavish, pathetic lifestyles, while telling my mother they needed to budget her medical care. I found records of massive recurring payments to luxury car dealerships covering the multiple Porsches and Mercedes vehicles. Jasmine paraded around town and pretending she was a successful influencer. There were enormous monthly deductions flowing into high-stakes online gambling platforms, tracking directly back to Bradley's personal routing numbers. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars just in the last quarter alone to cover his catastrophic gambling debts. The realization hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. The $50,000 luxury vacation they were currently enjoying in Hawaii was fully funded by money stolen directly from my mother. Marcus had intentionally downgraded my mother's premium health insurance plan last year, claiming the company needed to tighten its belt during a tough economic quarter. He told her she needed to sacrifice for the good of the family. Meanwhile, he was quietly siphoning millions of dollars to ensure his favorite spoiled daughter and his fraudulent son-in-law could fly first class and drink expensive champagne on a private yacht. They had literally stolen my mother's safety, and physical security to buy themselves a few more rounds of applause from their fake high society friends. They let her suffer with a failing heart so they could eat at a Michelin star restaurant. I sat back in my father's expensive leather chair, surrounded by the undeniable written proof of their spectacular ultimate betrayal. My heart pounded a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs, echoing the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. They thought they were so incredibly smart. They thought they could operate in the shadows forever, using my mother as a silent, limitless bank account while treating her like an embarrassing burden they had to tolerate. They thought they had left the boring, practical daughter behind to clean up their ugly messes while they lived like absolute royalty on stolen cash. I gathered the ledgers and financial statements, carefully organizing the explosive evidence into neat, undeniable stacks on the desk. My corporate training kicked into high gear, overriding the lingering shock and deep heartbreak of the night. I was no longer just the forgotten daughter sorting through messy family drama. I was a highly specialized financial auditor preparing to execute a hostile legal takeover. Marcus and Bradley had gotten sloppy in their blinding arrogance, leaving a paper trail a mile wide because they never believed anyone in this house was smart enough to catch them. They severely underestimated the woman they had spent decades trying to break down and push aside. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, firing it up as the first faint light of dawn began to creep through the office windows. I had all the hidden account numbers, all the secret routing codes, and all the absolute legal authority granted by my mother to access the trust fund control portals. It was time to start freezing the assets and slamming the doors shut. It was time to permanently cut the puppet strings that funded their fake reality. When Marcus and Jasmine swiped those stolen black cards at their fancy dinner tonight, they were going to encounter a very rude awakening. I began typing rapidly, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I initiated the first aggressive phase of my mother ultimate revenge. I sat at the massive oak desk as the morning sun slowly faded into a cold, dark evening, the house remaining completely silent around me, a stark contrast to the storm that was brewing inside the home office. I had called in reinforcements hours ago. Sitting across from me in the dim light of a single brass desk lamp were two men who were about to help me dismantle my father's entire fake empire. Thomas was a ruthless forensic accountant I knew from my corporate dealings in Chicago, and Gregory was the highly specialized trust lawyer my mother had secretly retained years ago but was always too afraid to utilize. They had arrived discreetly through the side entrance, carrying thick leather briefcases and laptops, ready to go to war for my mother. We worked tirelessly through the night, surrounded by towering stacks of stolen wealth records. Thomas' fingers flew across his keyboard, tracking every single stolen dollar from my mother generational trust fund across multiple offshore accounts. Gregory was meticulously drafting the emergency legal injunctions, preparing the ironclad documents that would permanently strip Marcus of his unearned power. The air in the room was thick with focused intensity fueled by cold, stale coffee and pure absolute rage. Right next to the heavy ledgers, my cell phone screen kept lighting up in the dark room. It was a sickening split-screen reality playing out in real time on the physical desk in front of me, lay the undeniable mathematical proof of their disgusting financial crimes on the digital screen of my phone. My younger sister Jasmine was broadcasting the fruits of those exact crimes to her thousands of fake followers. She was posting nonstop on social media documenting every single second of their stolen luxury vacation. I watched a video of Jasmine posing on the deck of a massive private yacht, the bright blue Hawaiian Ocean, stretching out endlessly behind her. She was wearing a designer swimsuit that likely cost more than my monthly rent, spinning around and laughing while holding an expensive tropical cocktail. Bradley stepped into the frame wearing overpriced sunglasses and a smug, arrogant grin, pulling her close for the camera. The caption under the video made me physically sick to my stomach. It read, "Living my best life in Maui, with hubby blessed old money." Old money. The sheer audacity of her using that specific phrase made my blood boil hot and fast. It was indeed old money, but it certainly did not belong to her or her fraudulent husband. It belonged to my mother, whose heart had literally stopped beating while they were busy securing their yacht rental. I showed the video to Thomas, the accountant, who simply shook his head in absolute disgust. He cross-referenced the timestamp of her post with the banking portal open on his computer. He pointed silently to the screen, showing that Bradley had just swiped my mother corporate credit card to pay $12,000 for that exact yacht excursion just 2 hours ago. They were actively draining my mother lifeblood while she lay hooked up to machines in an intensive care unit, and they were bragging about it to the entire world. Jasmine continued to post endless stories, showing off their Michelin star dinner plates, featuring rare caviar and imported Wagyu beef. She posted close-up shots of a new diamond tennis bracelet. Bradley had supposedly surprised her with calling him the most amazing provider in the world. Every single post was a documented confession of their grand larceny. They were providing us with a real-time geographical map of their stolen funds. Gregory, the lawyer, took screenshots of every single post, carefully adding them to the growing digital evidence file. He noted that their extreme public arrogance was going to make the upcoming legal prosecution incredibly easy. They were literally handing us the rope we would use to hang them. As the clock struck 3:00 the morning, my phone vibrated loudly against the wooden desk. It was a direct message from Jasmine. I opened the text, expecting perhaps a tiny shred of human decency, or maybe a brief delayed question about whether our mother had survived the night. Instead, I found a list of ridiculous entitled demands, Camille, since you are just sitting around the house doing nothing, I need you to go into my bedroom and organize my massive walk-in closet before we get back on Wednesday. She wrote, "The maids never fold my designer cashmere sweaters correctly, and it drives me crazy. I need you to color code all my shoes and make sure my winter coats are steamed. Do not mess it up because Bradley and I are hosting a welcome back party next weekend and I need my outfits ready." I stared at the glowing text message, completely numb to her monumental selfishness. She truly viewed me as nothing more than the unpaid family servant, a secondary character in the grand movie of her fabulous life, whose only purpose was to facilitate her comfort. She had no concern for her dying mother and no respect for her older sister. But the absolute peak of their collective delusion arrived 10 minutes later when a text message from Marcus popped onto my screen. "Camille, make sure you pay the estate utility bills tomorrow morning." He ordered, his words dripping with his usual condescending authority. "The property taxes and the electric bill are due. You need to pay them out of your own pocket this month since you are staying in my house, Roundtree, and eating all our expensive food. It is the least you can do to contribute to this family. Do not make me remind you again." The sheer unadulterated gall of the man was almost fascinating to witness. A man who had just embezzled millions of dollars from his sick wife. A man who was currently sleeping in a 5-star luxury resort suite funded by stolen generational wealth was ordering his scapegoat daughter to pay his electric bill out of her own hard-earned salary. He was demanding that I subsidize the very house he was using to project his fake billionaire lifestyle. I did not reply with anger. I did not type back an furious paragraph defending myself or explaining that my mother owned every single brick of that house. I simply took a screenshot of his pathetic demand and forwarded it directly to Gregory. Every word they typed was just another nail in their own customized coffin. I placed the phone face down on the desk, entirely done with their digital abuse, and focused entirely on the destruction of their reality. The sky outside the office windows began to turn a pale, bruised gray as the sun prepared to rise over Atlanta. We had been working for over 12 straight hours, but none of us felt an ounce of fatigue. We had successfully mapped out the entire financial architecture of their crimes. We had gathered every document, every bank statement, and every forged signature Bradley had used to move the money offshore. Gregory closed his thick leather binder and looked at me across the desk. "We have everything we need, Camille," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "The trust documents are completely clear. Evelyn has absolute sole authority over the holding company and the real estate portfolio. With the emergency medical power of attorney, she signed over to you in the hospital. You now possess the complete legal right to act on her behalf. We can initiate the lockdown immediately." I nodded, feeling a cold, heavy calm settle over my entire body. "Do it," I instructed, my voice, steady and resolute. "Burn their bridge to the ground." Gregory opened his secure legal portal on his laptop with a series of rapid keystrokes. He formally submitted the emergency injunctions to the state courts and the corporate banking institutions. We executed a complete and total legal freeze on all corporate assets and personal accounts tied to the fraudulent activities. The massive wells of cash that Marcus and Bradley relied upon to fund their fake reality were instantly sealed shut behind an impenetrable wall of legal red tape. Next, we targeted their professional standing. Gregory drafted and transmitted the formal termination notices directly to the company, Human Resources Department, and the Board of Directors. We officially revoked Marcus' executive privileges and completely terminated his role as Chief Executive Officer, citing overwhelming documented evidence of suspected financial fraud, grand embezzlement, and gross corporate misconduct. We did the exact same thing to Bradley, stripping him of his fake Chief Financial Officer title and locking him completely out of the company servers. They were no longer powerful executives. They were terminated suspects pending federal investigation. Finally came the most crucial and satisfying step of the entire morning. I logged directly into the master banking portal that controlled the family private wealth accounts. I navigated to the section managing the exclusive black credit cards. These were the exact supplementary cards tied directly to my mother's name. The very cards Marcus, Jasmine, and Bradley were currently swiping all over the island of Maui to buy champagne diamonds and yacht rides. I stared at the screen, watching the pending transactions from Hawaii, attempting to clear through the system. I thought about my mother lying in the intensive care unit, fighting for every breath, while her family laughed in the sun. I thought about the text message demanding I pay the utility bills while they stole millions. I placed my finger on the mouse pad, hovering over the master control switch. With one firm, deliberate click, I terminated every single supplementary card. The screen refreshed, showing the account statuses changing from active to permanently disabled. The financial lifeline was completely and permanently severed. There would be no more luxury dinners. There would be no more designer shopping sprees. There would be no way to pay for their 5-star hotel suite or their expensive return flights. They were stranded on an island thousands of miles from home with absolutely no access to the stolen wealth they had grown so deeply accustomed to. I leaned back in my father's expensive leather chair, letting out a long, slow breath as the morning sunlight finally broke through the window blinds. The trap was officially sprung. The golden cage they had built for themselves was now locked tight, and they were about to experience the terrifying freefall of hitting absolute rock bottom. The bright tropical sun beat down relentlessly on the open-air marble lobby of the Four Seasons Resort in Maui. Gentle trade winds carried the sweet scent of blooming plumeria flowers and expensive coconut sunscreen through the massive pavilion. The sound of crashing ocean waves echoed in the distance, creating a perfect symphony of paradise. Bradley stood at the sleek mahogany concierge desk, exuding the arrogant entitlement of a man who believed he owned the entire island he was dressed in. Overpriced linen resort wear that he had purchased using my mother's stolen money just 2 days prior. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, and his posture was rigid with unearned superiority. Standing right beside him was my younger sister, Jasmine. She was busy admiring the massive diamond tennis bracelet glittering on her wrist, completely ignoring the dedicated hotel staff working behind the desk. They were checking out of their luxury suite, preparing to move to an even more exclusive private beachfront villa for the remainder of their stolen vacation. The front desk manager, a polite man in a crisp uniform, handed Bradley a silver tray containing their itemized hotel folio. The grand total sat proudly at the bottom of the page, reflecting a staggering $15,000. It covered their massive upgraded suite, endless bottles of vintage champagne, private couples massages, and the extravagant yacht excursion they had bragged about online. Bradley did not even bother to look at the itemized charges. He simply offered a smug, condescending smile and reached into his designer leather wallet. He pulled out the heavy metal black card tied directly to my mother, generational wealth, and tossed it carelessly onto the silver tray. He expected the staff to bow in reverence at the sight of such limitless financial power. The manager smiled professionally and inserted the heavy metal card into the payment terminal. A few seconds of tense silence passed over the marble desk. The machine let out a sharp low beep, indicating an error. The manager frowned slightly and pulled the card out, wiping the magnetic strip with a soft cloth before inserting it a second time. The machine beeped again, flashing a bright red error message across the small digital screen. Bradley let out a loud, irritated sigh, shifting his weight impatiently from one foot to the other. He loudly complained that the hotel equipment was outdated and demanded that the manager try running the transaction again. The manager maintained his perfect polite composure and gently explained that the card was being completely declined by the issuing bank. The color drained slightly from Bradley's face as he snatched the card back from the counter. He muttered something under his breath about incompetent bank security triggers and pulled a different premium credit card from his wallet. This one was also tied to the family corporate account. He slapped it down on the desk with an arrogant flick of his wrist. The manager ran the second card through the machine. Another sharp low beep echoed through the quiet luxury lobby, declined again. Jasmine finally looked up from her diamond bracelet, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in deep frustration. She loudly asked Bradley what was taking so long and complained that the private driver was waiting outside in the heat to take them to their next villa. Bradley was beginning to sweat through his expensive linen shirt. His hands shook slightly as he realized he had absolutely no access to any of the funds he relied upon to maintain his fake billionaire persona. He had completely drained his own personal bank accounts months ago to cover his hidden online gambling debts without my mother's stolen money. He was completely broke. Marcus had been lingering nearby, admiring a display of expensive local artwork when he noticed the commotion at the front desk. He strutted over with his chest puffed out, severely annoyed that his relaxing morning routine was being interrupted by a billing issue. He pushed Bradley aside with a rough shove of his shoulder, calling his son-in-law a pathetic amateur who did not know how to handle high-level banking logistics. Marcus confidently pulled his own primary executive black card from his jacket pocket. He smiled arrogantly at the hotel manager, apologizing for his son-in-law incompetence, and instructed the staff to put the entire $15,000 balance on his personal account. The manager nodded respectfully and ran the card through the terminal. The entire lobby seemed to hold its collective breath as the machine processed the data. A loud, definitive beep signaled the third consecutive failure. The red declined message flashed brightly against the dark plastic screen. Marcus' arrogant smile vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The front desk manager cleared his throat, his tone dropping its warm hospitality and taking on a firm, serious edge. He informed Marcus that every single payment method associated with their family profile had been permanently rejected by the banking institution. He politely but firmly asked if they had another independent form of payment to settle the massive outstanding balance before they would be allowed to leave the premises. Several wealthy guests standing nearby in the lobby began to turn their heads, whispering quietly among themselves as the embarrassing scene unfolded. The glorious illusion of their immense generational wealth was cracking wide open in the middle of a crowded luxury resort. Marcus began shouting at the manager, threatening to have him fired and demanding to speak to the resort owner. He slammed his fist down on the mahogany desk, insisting that he was a powerful real estate mogul from Atlanta, and that this was nothing more than a ridiculous clerical error. The hotel manager simply signaled to the resort security team, who began walking slowly toward the front desk. Marcus grabbed his cell phone from his pocket, his hands trembling with rage and humiliation as he stormed away from the desk toward a quiet corner of the lobby, leaving Bradley and Jasmine to endure the shameful stares of the surrounding staff. Thousands of miles away in the darkened, freezing city of Atlanta, I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the corner of a dimly lit hospital room. The sterile environment smelled strongly of harsh chemical cleaners and rubbing alcohol. The rhythmic, steady beeping of the heart monitor attached to my mother's chest was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Evelyn was resting peacefully, her breathing slow and measured. Now that the terrifying crisis had passed, the complex web of intravenous tubes and wires keeping her alive stood in stark contrast to the luxurious tropical paradise my family was currently enjoying. I held a styrofoam cup of lukewarm, bitter cafeteria coffee in my hands, letting the weak heat warm my tired fingers. I had not slept in over 24 hours, but I had never felt more energized or completely alive. The massive legal and financial trap we had spent the entire night building was fully operational. I was simply sitting in the quiet shadows, waiting for the inevitable explosion to reach my phone. The screen of my cell phone suddenly lit up, vibrating aggressively against the hard plastic armrest of my chair. The caller identification displayed my father's name in bold, bright letters. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my terrible coffee. Savoring the bitter taste on my tongue, I let the phone vibrate for several long, agonizing seconds before finally picking it up and sliding my finger across the screen to accept the call. I did not say a word, simply bringing the device to my ear and waiting for his desperate voice to break the silence. "Camille, you need to call the corporate bank right this exact second." Marcus barked through the receiver, his voice an erratic mixture of hushed panic and explosive rage. He was clearly trying to keep his voice down to avoid drawing more attention from the resort security guards. But his fury was impossible to hide. He demanded to know what kind of incompetent mess I had made of the estate accounts while they were away. He claimed that some idiot automated security system had frozen all their premium cards because of the overseas travel and accused me of failing to submit the proper international travel notices to our wealth management team. He ordered me to get the bank president on the phone immediately and forced them to unfreeze the accounts before the hotel management called the local police to report them for theft of services. I leaned back in my plastic chair, resting my head against the cold-painted cinder block wall behind me. I kept my voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotion, projecting the innocent confusion of a beautiful daughter who had absolutely no idea what was happening. I told him that sounded like a terrible situation, but I had not touched any of the corporate banking portals since he left. I softly suggested that perhaps the bank had finally noticed a pattern of unusual spending and locked the accounts. Automatically, I innocently asked if maybe he and Jasmine had simply spent too much money on their shopping sprees and completely maxed out the credit limits on the cards. Marcus exploded through the phone, spewing curses and insults. He shouted that the executive black cards had absolutely no spending limits and that my mother trust fund held tens of millions of dollars. He told me to stop asking stupid questions and just fix the problem immediately because they were entirely stranded in the hotel lobby with a $15,000 bill. They could not pay. They could not access their suite, and they could not move to their next beachfront villa until the balance was completely settled. They were effectively trapped in paradise with absolutely zero access to their stolen wealth. the luxury vacation they had abandoned. My dying mother to enjoy had suddenly transformed into a gilded, terrifying prison. I took another slow sip of my coffee, letting his desperate, breathless panic echo through the small hospital room. I looked over at my mother, pale face, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin hospital blanket. The time for playing the innocent, ignorant daughter was completely over. I spoke into the receiver, my voice dropping into a cold, sharp register that cut right through his panicked rambling. I told him he was acting completely ridiculous and making a massive deal out of a minor inconvenience. I reminded him that he was currently standing in that hotel lobby with Bradley, his brilliant and highly successful chief financial officer. I casually pointed out that since Bradley was a wealthy corporate executive who was constantly expanding our family portfolio, he surely had more than enough personal wealth to cover a tiny $15,000 hotel bill. I suggested that Marcus simply ask his beloved, perfect son-in-law to pull out his own private credit card and settle the debt right now. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the exact moment. The horrifying reality finally crashed down upon my father. Arrogant shoulders. I could hear the muffled sounds of Marcus pulling the phone away from his face and frantically ordering Bradley to step up and pay the hotel manager. I listened with profound, immense satisfaction as Bradley began to stammer and choke on his own words, making pathetic, fragmented excuses about his private investments being temporarily tied up in illiquid assets and his personal banking tokens being left back in Atlanta. The absolute sheer terror in Bradley's voice was undeniable, as his massive financial fraud was suddenly exposed in the middle of a Hawaiian resort. Marcus was finally realizing that the wealthy, brilliant son-in-law he worshipped was actually a completely broke, useless parasite who did not have a single dime to his name. I told my father they had better figure out a solution very quickly before the police arrived to arrest them for fraud. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call button, terminating the connection permanently. I set the phone down on the table and smiled, letting the quiet, peaceful hum of the hospital monitors wash over me while they drowned in their own spectacular ruin across the ocean. I remained in the sterile quiet of my mother hospital room, holding the disconnected phone in my lap while the absolute chaos of their reality set in thousands of miles away on the island of Maui. My younger sister Jasmine was experiencing a level of public humiliation. She had spent her entire life mocking other people for enduring the resort. Security had politely but firmly escorted them out of the main luxury lobby to a discreet waiting area near the service elevators, treating them exactly like the fraudulent trespassers they were. Jasmine was sitting on a stiff fabric sofa, her hands trembling violently as she scrolled through her extensive contact list of wealthy Atlanta socialites. She had spent years carefully cultivating a fake inner circle of elite friends, women who wore exclusively designer labels, drove imported luxury vehicles, and judged human worth entirely by the balance of a bank account. She wiped away her mascara, stained in tears, and pressed the call button, desperately trying to reach her absolute best friend, Victoria, a woman whose husband owned a massive chain of luxury car dealerships in Georgia. Jasmine held the phone to her ear, expecting Victoria to immediately wire $20,000 to her account without asking a single question, because that is what best friends in their tax bracket were supposed to do. Instead, Victoria answered the phone with a cold, distant tone that made Jasmine's stomach completely drop when Jasmine fabricated a pathetic story about a temporary bank error and asked for an emergency wire transfer. Victoria let out a dry hollow. She told Jasmine that she would love to help, but all her liquid assets were currently tied up in a new commercial real estate venture. Before Jasmine could even beg, Victoria abruptly ended the call, citing an urgent appointment at the spa. Jasmine stared at absolute shock. She quickly dialed another number, calling a woman named Savannah, whose family owned several prominent country clubs across the state. Savannah did not even bother to answer, sending the call straight to voicemail. After 2 rings, Jasmine tried a third friend, and then a fourth and a fifth. Every single wealthy socialite she contacted either ignored her call completely or offered transparent, pathetic excuses about their finances being temporarily restricted. It was a sudden, inexplicable drought of generosity that left Jasmine completely paralyzed with fear. What Jasmine did not know as she sat sobbing in the service hallway of the resort was that her sudden social excommunication was not a coincidence at all, while Thomas and Gregory were drafting the legal injunctions in my father's home office earlier that morning. I had taken 5 minutes to draft a highly confidential, completely anonymous email. I sent it directly to the president of my father-exclusive country club and carbon-copied the 3 biggest gossips in their elite social circle. The email contained vague but terrifyingly specific details about a sudden federal audit crashing down on our family real estate empire. It mentioned frozen trust funds, massive offshore embezzlement, and impending criminal investigations involving Marcus and Bradley in the affluent, highly competitive world of Atlanta high society. Rumors of federal audits and criminal fraud spread much faster than a blazing wildfire. By the time Jasmine started making her desperate phone calls, her entire social network already knew that her family was toxic radioactive waste. Associating with them or sending them wire transfers right now would be absolute social suicide. They dropped her instantly, treating her like a contagious disease, cutting her off from the fake, glittering world she cherished more than her own dying mother. The ultimate realization washed over her as she sat in that humid hallway looking at her useless phone. She had absolutely no real friends. Her entire existence was a shallow, transactional lie, and without my mother's stolen money, she was absolutely nothing to these people. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the Hawaiian sky, the desperation of their situation reached a critical breaking point. The hotel management gave them exactly 1 hour to remove their belongings from the property or face immediate arrest for trespassing. Bradley, pacing back and forth with his expensive linen shirt, soaked in nervous sweat, finally voiced the only remaining option they had left. He pointed a shaking finger at the massive pile of designer luggage sitting next to them. Jasmine had insisted on bringing 3 limited-edition custom Hermes Birkin bags and a completely matching set of genuine Louis Vuitton travel trunks for a 1-week vacation. Bradley told her in a harsh, defeated whisper that they had to sell the bags to buy plane tickets home. Jasmine erupted into a shrieking, violent tantrum. She screamed that she would rather die than part with her precious status symbols. But Marcus grabbed her roughly by the arm, his own arrogant pride completely shattered. He told her to shut up and pack her clothes into cheap plastic garbage bags because they had absolutely no other choice. They dragged their expensive luggage down the street, sweating profusely in the tropical heat until they found a dingy, dimly lit pawn shop tucked away in a cheap strip mall far from the luxury resorts. The pawn shop owner, a heavily tattooed man who cared absolutely nothing about Atlanta. High society took one look at their desperate, sweating faces and offered them literal pennies on the dollar for the pristine designer goods. Jasmine wept openly, tears ruining her expensive makeup as she watched the man toss her beloved $50,000 handbag collection onto a dusty glass counter, handing Bradley a small, meager stack of worn $100 bills. It was barely enough to cover 3 last-minute tickets on the cheapest, worst airline available. They rode to the airport in absolute miserable silence, dreading the journey ahead. There were no luxury cars waiting for them. There was no expedited first-class boarding process. They were forced to stand in the longest, slowest security line packed shoulder to shoulder with screaming toddlers and exhausted tourists. When they finally boarded the red-eye flight back to the mainland, the full weight of their humiliation crushed whatever remaining dignity they had. They were seated in the very back row of the economy cabin, completely separated from one another. Marcus, the man who boasted about never flying commercial without a first class, pod was wedged tightly into a tiny middle seat between a passenger who snored loudly and another who kept spilling cheap soda onto his expensive trousers. Bradley sat near the bathrooms, enduring the constant slamming of the heavy doors and the terrible smells, while Jasmine curled into a tiny ball in a window seat, crying quietly as she realized she was flying home to an uncertain, terrifying future as the plane cruised through the dark night sky. My phone buzzed softly in the quiet hospital room. It was a series of notifications from the family group chat. Marcus had apparently purchased the expensive in-flight internet just to send me a barrage of furious, threatening messages. "Camille, you are completely dead to me." He typed his words practically vibrating with unhinged rage. "I do not know what kind of pathetic computer trick you played with the bank, but you are going to regret making a fool out of me. I am currently sitting in a miserable coach seat because of your utter incompetence. You better have a hot meal and my car waiting at the airport. When we land, I am going to make you pay for your stupidity when I get home. And you better have all your bags packed, because you are getting thrown out on the street the second I walk through the front door." I read the messages, my face completely devoid of any fear or intimidation. My mother was sleeping soundly beside me, her heart monitor displaying a strong, steady rhythm that gave me endless peace. I looked at the threatening words Marcus had typed, attempting to exert power he no longer possessed. He was flying back to a reality where his entire empire was already burned to the absolute ground. The forensic accountant had secured every document the trust lawyer had filed, every injunction, and the locks on the mansion doors had already been permanently changed by the private security team I hired. I typed out a response, keeping my tone as polite and obedient as I always did, playing the role of the beautiful daughter one last time. "Everything is ready for your arrival," I replied, hitting the send button and placing the phone back down on the table. My words were absolutely true. Everything was indeed ready for them. They were coming home to face the absolute total destruction of their lives, and I was going to enjoy every single second of the fallout. The pale morning sun had fully risen. By the time I finally left the hospital, my mother was resting comfortably under the watchful eyes of the best cardiac specialists in Atlanta. Her condition was stable, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt a profound sense of protective power over the woman who had brought me into this world. I drove back to the sprawling suburban estate, the large iron gates opening smoothly as I pulled my car up the long, winding driveway. The house was no longer a cold, empty tomb. It was about to become the staging ground for the most spectacular reckoning this family had ever seen. I walked through the heavy wooden front doors and immediately began transforming the massive luxury living room into a cold, sterile corporate boardroom. I pushed the expensive designer sofas and plush velvet armchairs against the far walls, clearing the center of the expansive room completely. I dragged the heavy, solid oak dining table from the formal dining room across the polished marble floors, positioning it directly in the middle of the space where the expensive Persian rug used to sit. I arranged 5 high-backed leather executive chairs in a straight line on one side of the table facing the front entryway, creating an undeniable wall of authority that they would be forced to confront the moment they stepped foot inside their former kingdom. Shortly after noon, the private security team I had hired arrived at the estate. They were 6 highly trained professionals dressed in sharp black suits, standing in stark contrast to the usual flashy caterers and country club friends. Marcus loved to parade through these halls. I instructed 2 of the guards to station themselves directly outside the front doors and place the remaining 4 strategically around the perimeter of the living room. Their presence was silent but physically imposing, establishing an immediate atmosphere of absolute control. An hour later, Gregory, the trust lawyer, and Thomas, the forensic accountant, arrived, carrying their heavy leather briefcases filled with the damning financial evidence we had compiled the night before they unpacked their laptops and arranged the thick stacks of banking ledgers, offshore account, routing numbers, and forged corporate documents neatly across the oak table. We sat together in a row facing the entryway like a panel of judges waiting for the guilty defendants to arrive. The house was perfectly quiet, the only sound being the soft humming of the central air conditioning and the occasional clicking of Thomas typing on his laptop keyboard. My phone displayed the flight tracking application showing their miserable economy flight from Hawaii, slowly making its way across the Pacific Ocean toward the Atlanta airport. I tracked their progress with a cold, calculating patience, imagining them sitting in their cramped middle seats, sweating and panicking about the disaster waiting for them at home. I ordered a simple black coffee and sat in the center chair, my hands folded neatly on top of the master trust file my mother had signed over to me. I was perfectly calm, completely detached from the lifetime of emotional abuse they had subjected me to. I was no longer their scapegoat daughter. I was the executioner of their fake reality, and I was ready to deliver the final blow. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the grand hallway echoed like a judge gavel striking a wooden block. I watched the flight tracker update minute by minute, watching the little airplane icon cross the continental United States, carrying my furious, ignorant family back to the slaughterhouse they had unwittingly built for themselves. Gregory slid a fresh stack of freshly printed termination documents across the oak table, aligning them perfectly with the forensic audit reports, highlighting Bradley offshore gambling transfers. Thomas was busy running a final security sweep on the locked banking portals, ensuring that absolutely no backdoor access remained for any of them. The sheer magnitude of their theft was laid out in undeniable black and white ink, a comprehensive roadmap of their monumental greed. I poured myself another cup of coffee, feeling the caffeine mix with the cold adrenaline pumping through my veins. I thought about the decades of subtle microaggressions, the constant belittling of my career, the way they looked at me with disguised pity at every family gathering while secretly bleeding my mother. All of those moments crystallized into a sharp, impenetrable armor around my heart. There would be no forgiveness today, There would be no desperate pleas for reconciliation. There would only be a swift, brutal, and entirely legal dismantling of their entire existence. The heavy grandfather clock struck 4 inches the afternoon when the sound of a cheap taxi pulling up the driveway finally broke the silence. I watched through the tall living room windows as Marcus Bradley and Jasmine piled out of a battered yellow cab, a stark contrast to the luxury black car service they usually demanded. They looked absolutely horrific. Their skin was bright red and peeling from severe sunburns, an agonizing reminder of the tropical vacation they were forced to abandon there. Designer resort wear had been replaced by cheap, wrinkled clothes they had likely purchased at a discount store near the airport. Since they had pawned all their expensive luggage in Maui, instead of dragging genuine Louis Vuitton travel trunks, they were carrying their remaining belongings in thin black plastic garbage bags, dragging them across the pristine driveway like vagrants. I could see Marcus arguing furiously with the taxi driver through the window, likely because his precious black cards were still entirely useless and he was being forced to hand over the very last of the cash they had received from the pawn shop. Jasmine was stomping her feet on the pavement, throwing a visible tantrum, while Bradley struggled to balance 3 different trash bags over his sunburned shoulders. They looked like absolute caricatures of their former wealthy selves, stripped of their unearned glamour, and reduced to the pathetic reality of their actual financial status. The heavy oak front door did not just open, it was violently kicked inward, slamming loudly against the interior wall. Marcus stormed into the foyer, his face purple with absolute unhinged rage. He dropped his garbage bag on the marble floor and immediately began screaming my name, his voice echoing harshly through the high ceilings. He stomped into the living room and froze for a fraction of a second when he saw the rearranged furniture. The severe-looking men in black suits in the imposing boardroom setup, but his blinding arrogance quickly overrode his confusion. He marched toward the table, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "You useless, vindictive girl," he screamed, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fury. "You actually let the bank freeze my accounts while I was on a business trip. You humiliating, incompetent failure. Do you have any idea what you have done? You ruined an entire week of vital networking because you are too stupid to manage a simple banking portal. You are completely out of the will. Camille, I am disinheriting you. The second my lawyers open their offices tomorrow morning, you are stripped of your title. You are out of the company and you are going to get out of my house, right? This exact second, pack your miserable bags and get off my property before I have you thrown out on the street." I sat perfectly still, my expression completely blank, not flinching or reacting to his explosive tantrum. Bradley stepped out from behind Marcus, puffing out his chest and trying to project the authority of a wealthy corporate executive despite looking like a sunburned, disheveled mess in a cheap, wrinkled t-shirt. He slammed his hands down on the edge of the oak table, leaning forward to intimidate me with his presence. "You are nothing but a glorified clerk." Camille Bradley hissed, his blue eyes wild with misplaced superiority. "You sit in a cubicle in Chicago, pushing papers around, and you think you have the right to interfere with my corporate logistics. You completely ruined my critical business trip. You embarrassed me in front of high-level international developers because you are a jealous, bitter woman who cannot stand to see her sister happy and successful. I am the chief financial officer of this family empire, and I am personally going to ensure you never work in the real estate industry again. I will destroy your pathetic little career by the end of the week." Jasmine pushed her way past the 2 men, dropping her own plastic trash bags on the floor. She was sobbing hysterically. Her expensive hair extensions tangled and matted, her makeup smudged down her sunburned cheeks. She pointed a shaking finger at me, wailing about how I had intentionally destroyed her dream vacation, forcing her to ride in the back of a disgusting airplane next to a screaming baby. She demanded that I immediately transfer $50,000 from my own savings account to compensate her for the emotional trauma and the designer bag she was forced to sell. She cried that I was a toxic monster who hated my own family, and that she would never ever forgive me for subjecting her to such horrific poverty. Marcus continued to rant, pacing back and forth in front of the oak table, his voice growing increasingly as he spewed a continuous stream of venomous insults. He called me an ungrateful burden, a spinster who only knew how to ruin the happiness of the people around her. He demanded to know where my mother was, insisting that she needed to come downstairs immediately and discipline me for my outrageous insubordination. He yelled that my mother was a weak, pathetic woman who had raised a treacherous daughter and that he was going to make both of us pay for the ultimate humiliation he suffered in that hotel lobby. Bradley chimed in again, threatening to call the local police to have me arrested for financial sabotage, completely unaware that the thick files sitting just inches from his hands contained the exact wire transfer routing numbers that were going to send him to federal prison. Jasmine sank to the floor next to her plastic garbage bags, burying her face in her hands, and screaming that her entire social life was ruined because her friends were ignoring her calls, blaming me entirely for her sudden, inexplicable exile from high society. I looked at the three of them, standing there in their cheap clothes, sweating and screaming and throwing their pathetic little tantrums. They were barking hollow threats and demanding apologies, completely blind to the fact that they were standing in a room surrounded by private security and forensic auditors. They were so deeply consumed by their own massive egos and lifelong delusions of grandeur that they could not even recognize the execution block they had just eagerly marched onto. The contrast between their hysterical, chaotic screaming and the absolute stone-cold silence of myself, the lawyer, the accountant, and the security team was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The men in the black suits stood perfectly still, their hands folded in front of them, watching the pathetic display of wealthy entitlement crashing into the concrete wall of reality. I let them exhaust themselves. I let Marcus scream until his face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. I let Bradley throw his hollow corporate threats into the empty air. I let Jasmine weep over her lost designer handbags and her shattered fake friendships. They were emptying the very last reserves of their arrogant power, pouring it out onto the floor of a house they no longer had any legal right to occupy. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my career or explain the bank freeze. I simply looked at Marcus straight in his furious bloodshot eyes and prepared to drop the anvil that would shatter their universe forever. The echo of their hollow threats was still bouncing off the high ceilings of the living room when a new sound suddenly cut through the heavy, tense air. It was a slow, deliberate squeak of premium leather rubbing against polished wood at the far end of the long oak table, positioned perfectly in the shadows of the expansive room. Sat a massive, high-backed leather executive chair that had been turned entirely away from the entryway, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the dark winter garden. None of them had paid any attention to it, assuming it was simply part of the intimidating boardroom aesthetic I had meticulously constructed to frighten them. But as the chair slowly began to revolve on its heavy metal axis, the air in the room seemed to freeze completely. The gentle turning motion was cinematic and terrifying, drawing every single eye in the room toward the shadows. Marcus stopped panting, his mouth dropping slightly open. Bradley took an involuntary step backward, his sunburned face draining of whatever color it had left, and Jasmine abruptly stopped her obnoxious crying, wiping her eyes to stare in absolute confusion. The chair completed its slow rotation, revealing the person sitting quietly in the shadows. It was not an empty prop, and it was certainly not another private security guard. It was my mother, Evelyn. She was not wearing the pale blue hospital gown they had likely envisioned when I told them she was in the emergency room. She was not hooked up to a dozen beeping medical monitors or struggling to breathe through a plastic oxygen mask. She was sitting perfectly upright, dressed in a razor-sharp, tailored navy blue power suit that radiated absolute wealth and undeniable authority. Her hair was immaculately styled, and her makeup was flawlessly applied, concealing the lingering pale exhaustion of her recent medical trauma. She looked like a ruthless corporate titan, preparing to dismantle a rival company. She did not look like a victim. She looked like a queen who had just reclaimed her stolen throne. The silence that fell over the room was so profound, it felt heavy enough to crush them. My mother. Dark eyes swept slowly over the three of them, taking in their pathetic sunburned faces, their cheap wrinkled clothing, and the black plastic garbage bags sitting at their feet. She looked at them with a terrifying mixture of absolute disgust and cold, detached pity, the kind of look you give a diseased insect before you crush it under your shoe. Jasmine was the first one to break the suffocating silence, her profound arrogance completely blinding her to the extreme danger radiating from my mother posture. She stood up from the floor, wiping her mascara-stained cheeks, and crossed her arms over her chest, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh of pure annoyance. "Mom, you are out of the hospital already," Jasmine stammered, her voice dripping with her usual toxic blend of whining, entitlement, and accusation. "I knew you were just faking it for attention. I told Camille you were just throwing a massive tantrum because you were jealous that Bradley booked this trip without you. Do you have any idea what you put us through? We had to sell my custom Hermes bags to a disgusting pawn shop in Hawaii just to buy economy tickets home. I had to sit next to a crying toddler for 9 hours because you decided to play sick and force Camille to freeze our bank accounts. You ruined my entire vacation, and you owe me $50,000 to replace my stolen luggage right now." My mother did not blink. She did not raise her voice to argue with the spoiled, ungrateful parasite she had unfortunately birthed into this world. Instead, she placed her hands firmly on the armrests of the heavy leather chair and slowly pushed herself up to a standing position. The movement was visibly painful, her face tightening for a fraction of a second as she fought through the physical agony radiating through her chest. But she refused to show them any real weakness. She stood tall and commanding her posture impeccably straight, projecting an aura of immense, terrifying power. She completely ignored Jasmine, ridiculous demands looking right through her as if she were completely invisible. Evelyn reached down to the polished oak table and picked up a thick, heavy stack of official medical documents and legal hospital records. She held the papers in her hand for a brief moment before dropping them violently onto the hard wooden surface. The heavy thud of the thick paper hitting the table echoed loudly in the dead silence of the room, jumping Marcus and Bradley out of their stunned paralysis. I flatlined for 2 full minutes. "Jasmine," my mother said, her voice slicing through the room like a jagged piece of freezing ice. "My heart completely stopped beating inside my chest while you were busy ordering expensive oysters on a luxury yacht. I was clinically dead on the floor of this very living room while your husband was swiping my stolen credit card to buy you more diamonds." Jasmine's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The smug, annoyed expression on her face instantly shattered, replaced by a look of profound, sickening horror. My mother did not stop. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her dark eyes locking onto Marcus, who was currently shaking in his cheap shoes. "The only reason I am standing here breathing right now is because the daughter you all treat like absolute garbage threw herself onto my body and broke 3 of my ribs, giving me brutal life." Saving chest compressions, my mother continued, her voice rising in power and intensity with every single word. "She broke my bones to force my heart to keep beating, while you, Marcus, stepped over my dying body to go play golf with your fraudulent son-in-law. She saved my life while you eagerly rushed to your flight, hoping I would conveniently pass away and leave you the keys to my entire empire." The sheer monumental weight of her words crashed down upon them, suffocating their arrogant egos and destroying their entire fake reality. In an instant, Marcus took a weak, trembling step backward, his hands shaking at his sides, the terrifying realization of his current situation finally penetrating his thick, narcissistic skull. He was not dealing with the quiet, obedient society wife who had tolerated his emotional abuse for 35 years. He was staring directly into the eyes of a woman who had crossed the threshold of death and returned with a singular burning desire for absolute vengeance. He realized with sickening clarity that the massive wall of security guards, the forensic accountant, and the high-powered trust lawyer were not here because of my supposed jealousy. They were here because his wife had finally decided to completely annihilate him. I watched from my seat at the center of the table, feeling a deep, profound sense of awe as my mother commanded the room. She did not look fragile or broken. She looked like an absolute force of nature, a hurricane of righteous fury wrapped in a tailored designer suit. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently and so completely that the air pressure literally felt different. Bradley was actively sweating, staring at the thick stack of medical records on the table, as if they were a ticking bomb. He knew that if my mother was well enough to stand here and confront them, she was definitely well enough to authorize the massive forensic audit that was currently freezing his stolen assets. He knew that his fake corporate title, his fake billionaire lifestyle, and his completely fraudulent existence were entirely over. Jess Mine let out a small, pathetic whimper, taking a hesitant step toward the table. "Mom, please," she whispered, her voice shaking with genuine fear. "Now, I did not know it was that serious. Dad told me you were just having acid reflux. He said you were being dramatic and that we had to leave for the airport. I would never have stayed on the island. If I knew your heart actually stopped. You have to believe me, Mom. I love you." My mother looked at Jasmine with a cold, empty expression, completely devoid of any maternal warmth or forgiveness. "You do not love anyone but yourself." "Jasmine," my mother replied, her tone completely flat and unyielding. "You did not even bother to call the hospital to check if I survived the night. You only cared about your frozen credit cards and your ruined social status. You spent your entire life feeding off my generosity, treating me like an endless cash machine while showing me absolutely zero respect or basic human decency. Do not dare stand in my house and pretend you care about my survival when your social media accounts prove you were celebrating while I was on life support. Marcus tried to intervene, clearing his dry throat and attempting to summon his usual booming, authoritative voice. Evelyn, sweetheart, please, you are clearly still recovering from a major medical trauma, he stammered, holding his hands up in a pathetic, placating gesture. We can explain everything. This is all just a terrible misunderstanding blown completely out of proportion by Camille. She is manipulating you against us because she is jealous of our success. You need to sit down and let me handle these security guards and these lawyers before they take advantage of your fragile state. Do not ever call me sweetheart again. My mother snarled, her voice echoing with dangerous, lethal authority. And do not ever disrespect the only child who actually loves me. You are not handling anything ever again, Marcus. Your days of managing my life, managing my money, and managing my fake public image are permanently over. I am fully awake. I am fully aware, and I am going to personally oversee the systematic destruction of your entire fraudulent existence. You brought this completely upon yourselves, and I am going to make sure you pay for every single tear I have shed over the last 3 decades. The absolute terror in the room was palpable. You could practically taste the metallic tang of fear radiating from the 3 of them. The unearned arrogance they had strutted into the house with just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, trembling reality of 3 parasites who had just been violently severed from their host. They had walked into what they believed was a minor confrontation with an insubordinate daughter, only to find themselves standing before a firing squad orchestrated by the matriarch they had left for dead. The stage was perfectly set. The masks were completely ripped off, and the real execution was finally ready to begin. Marcus stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment, as the reality of my mother standing before him threatened to shatter his fragile, narcissistic ego. But men like my father do not surrender to the truth easily. They fight it with a desperate, blinding arrogance that defies all logic and reason. He closed his eyes tightly for a fraction of a second, and when he opened them again, the sheer panic had been violently shoved down, replaced by the familiar, booming, authoritative presence he had used to terrorize our family for over 3 decades. He straightened his posture, pushing his shoulders back and thrusting his chest forward, attempting to physically dominate the space. Despite wearing a cheap, wrinkled souvenir shirt from a Hawaiian pawn shop, he took a heavy, deliberate step toward the center of the room, completely ignoring the imposing wall of private security guards, who immediately tensed at his sudden aggressive movement. Evelyn, you are clearly suffering from severe medical delirium. Marcus boomed, his deep baritone voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings of the mansion. He used his signature corporate tone, the one he reserved for intimidating rival contractors and silencing boardroom denters. The doctors warned me that your heart medication could cause severe hallucinations and extreme emotional instability. You need to sit down immediately before you trigger another cardiac event and force me to call in. Ambulance. You are completely confused, and you are letting this bitter, jealous daughter of ours manipulate your fragile mental state because she has always resented our success. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at me, his eyes narrowing with absolute contempt. Evelyn, tell your daughter to know her place, right? This exact second, he commanded, projecting an aura of supreme patriarchal authority. Tell her to call off these ridiculous sonnet actors and shut down this pathetic theatrical display she has orchestrated. I have tolerated her insubordinate behavior for far too long simply because I felt sorry for her. Pathetic, lonely life sitting in her tiny Chicago apartment running basic spreadsheets for people who actually matter. But this has crossed the line into outright corporate sabotage. I am the head of this household, Evelyn. I am the chief executive officer of our family empire. I am the man who put food on this table and elevated our name to the very top of the Atlanta elite high society. You are my wife, and you will instruct her to reverse this absurd bank freeze immediately before I have her thrown in a federal prison for corporate espionage. He continued to pace back and forth in front of the heavy oak table, trying desperately to reclaim his stolen kingdom through the sheer volume of his voice. He spun a ridiculous, elaborate fantasy about his own self-made greatness. He shouted about how he had rescued my mother from obscurity, how he had taken her family modest trust fund and transformed it into a billion-dollar real estate juggernaut through his unmatched brilliant business acumen. He demanded respect, claiming that every single brick in this massive estate was paid for by the sweat on his brow. He tried to rally Bradley and Jasmine, gesturing wildly toward them as if they were his loyal royal subjects, commanding them to stand tall and reject my mother. Insane accusations. Bradley tried to puff out his chest again, taking a cue from my father. Delusional confidence. He nodded along with Marcus, crossing his arms and attempting to look like an intimidating corporate executive. Jasmine stopped crying entirely clinging to her father, booming words like a life raft in a violent storm. She looked at my mother with a mixture of anger and desperate entitlement, convinced that her father, loud authoritative demands, would magically reset the universe and restore her stolen credit cards. Marcus turned his attention to Gregory, the trust lawyer, and Thomas, the forensic accountant, threatening to sue them into absolute poverty for participating in what he called a ridiculous illegal mutiny. He shouted that he owned the very floorboards they were standing on and demanded they pack up their briefcases and leave his private property before he called the local police chief, who happened to be his personal golfing buddy. Marcus took another aggressive step toward my mother, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that used to make me cower in fear as a child. "Evelyn, you are making a monumental mistake," he hissed, his eyes burning with toxic fury. "I am the only reason you have this beautiful life. I am the only reason our friends at the country club respect you. Do not let this jealous little girl convince you to destroy everything I have built for us. You need to stop this madness right now. Tell her to step down. Tell her to hand over the passwords and beg for my forgiveness. Or so help me God. I will walk out that front door and leave you completely alone with nothing but your boring, miserable daughter." He spoke with such raw, terrifying conviction that for a tiny fleeting second, I wondered if his sheer force of will could actually alter reality. He painted himself as the ultimate martyr, the flawless patriarch who sacrificed his entire life to carry the heavy burden of a sick, ungrateful wife and a malicious, treacherous daughter. He talked about the $50,000 vacation as if it were a mandatory business trip essential for the survival of the family company. He claimed that Bradley networking efforts in Hawaii were on the verge of securing a massive international contract that would have secured their wealth for generations, and that my petty, jealous interference had single-handedly destroyed their financial future. He demanded that my mother show him the respect he had rightfully earned over 35 years of marriage, insisting that a woman place was to stand silently behind her husband, not conspire against him with a team of hired corporate mercenaries. He pointed out the windows to the sprawling manicured lawns, claiming that without his daily supervision, the entire estate would crumble into absolute ruin. He was fighting for his life, using every single manipulation tactic, every piece of gaslighting rhetoric, and every ounce of patriarchal intimidation he had perfected over the decades. He truly believed that if he just shouted loud enough and acted angry enough, my mother would eventually fold back into her quiet, obedient shell, just like she had always done, before he finished his massive tyrannical monologue by slamming his fist down onto the heavy oak table, demanding absolute, immediate compliance from everyone in the room. The heavy thud of his fist against the wood echoed through the silent room. But it did not trigger the fearful submission he so desperately expected. Instead, I slowly stood up from my seat at the center of the table, the legs of my heavy leather executive chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor. I picked up the thick master legal file that Gregory had prepared. The physical culmination of an entire night of forensic investigation. I looked directly into my father, furious bloodshot, eyes letting a cold, dead silence stretch between us until his false confidence began to visibly waver under the weight of my absolute calm. "No, Marcus, you are not," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotion, dropping the massive master file onto the table right in front of his shaking hands. "You are not the head of this household. You are not the chief executive officer of anything, and you have never owned a single brick of this estate." I opened the thick file, spreading the original generational trust documents across the smooth oak surface, the very documents he had never been allowed to see. The heavy premium paper bore the original watermarks and wax seals of my great-grandfather, a man of true vision and immense power. "You spent 35 years parading around Atlanta, pretending you were a self-made real estate king, buying your way into exclusive country clubs, and demanding absolute respect from the local politicians. But the deniable legal truth is written right here on these pages. This entire empire, the holding company, the commercial properties, the offshore accounts, And the very ground you are standing on belongs entirely to my mother family. Trust. You never built a single thing. Marcus, you were nothing more than an overpaid, arrogant employee, living entirely on your wife, silent generosity, playing dress-up with money you did not earn. His face turned a sickening shade of gray as his eyes darted across the official legal seals and notarized signatures on the trust documents. I slid the final executive transfer agreement forward, tapping my finger against the fresh ink at the bottom of the page while you were sitting in economy class sweating in your cheap souvenir shirt. My mother formally executed her right as the sole generational beneficiary. I continued, my voice ringing with absolute finality. She just signed 100% of the corporate voting shares, the entire real estate portfolio, and the complete ownership of this estate over to me. I am the sole managing director of the trust. Now, Marcus, you own absolutely nothing. You have zero authority, zero assets, and zero leverage. You are officially trespassing on my private property. Marcus stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck in the chest, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the catastrophic reality of his total ruin finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his massive ego. He looked at my mother, begging silently for a reprieve, but Evelyn just stared back at him with eyes made of pure solid ice. I did not give him a single second to recover. I immediately turned my cold, piercing gaze toward Bradley, who was currently trying to slowly inch his way backward toward the front door, hoping to escape the blast radius of my financial execution. I picked up a separate red folder prepared by Thomas, the forensic accountant, and held it up for the entire room to see. "And you, the genius CFO?" I said, mocking the ridiculous corporate title he had paraded around with for years, my voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "You strutted into this house, acting like you were the ultimate savior of our family portfolio, looking down your nose at me while you pretended to negotiate massive international development deals. We ran a full, comprehensive forensic audit on your private executive accounts last night, Bradley. We found the wire transfers. We found the hidden routing numbers. And we found the massive black hole of your disgusting financial crimes." Bradley froze his face, turning a stark, terrifying shade of white, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door, guarded by the private security team. I slammed the red folder down onto the oak table right next to my father. "Ruined legacy. We found the $3 million you funneled directly out of my mother private medical accounts into illegal offshore gambling syndicates in the Cayman Islands." I announced, watching the absolute terror wash over his sunburned face. "You did not lose that money in a bad real estate investment. You gambled it all away on high-stakes poker and illegal sports betting while telling my mother the company was experiencing a difficult quarter." I slowly turned my head to look at Jasmine, whose jaw had completely dropped, her eyes wide with horrific disbelief as she stared at the man she proudly called her wealthy provider. "You thought you married a brilliant white corporate executive who was going to fund your luxury socialite lifestyle forever. Jasmine," I said, delivering the ultimate fatal blow to her perfect fake reality. "He has absolutely no money. He never had any money. His own personal bank accounts have been overdrawn for 6 months, has been paying for your Hermes bags and your diamond bracelets, using the cash he stole directly from our mother trust fund. He did not marry you for love, Jasmine. He married you because you were an incredibly stupid, easy target. He married you solely to bleed my mother, legacy dry, to pay off his massive underground gambling debts." Jasmine lunged at Bradley, her manicured hands curled into tight claws, striking his chest and shoulders with a frantic, feral energy, her voice breaking into a high-pitched, hysterical shriek that echoed violently off the vaulted ceilings of the mansion. The pristine image of the perfectly curated wealthy housewife completely evaporated in a matter of seconds, replaced by the terrifying reality of a woman suddenly facing federal prison and absolute bankruptcy. She beat her fists against his cheap, wrinkled souvenir shirt, screaming that he was a monster, a liar, and a completely useless fraud. Bradley stumbled backward, trying to shield his sunburned face from her relentless physical assault, tripping over the black plastic garbage bags they had dragged into the foyer just minutes before. Jasmine was weeping uncontrollably, her expensive hair extensions flying wildly around her face as she desperately tried to distance herself from the catastrophic financial crimes I had just exposed on the oak table. She spun away from her husband and threw herself toward the center of the room, falling to her knees, right in front of the high-backed leather chair, where our mother sat in absolute stone-cold silence. "Mom, you have to believe me," Jasmine wailed, her voice thick with raw panic and sheer desperation, her tears leaving dark, smeared streaks of expensive mascara down her bright red sunburned cheeks. I did not know anything about the offshore gambling accounts. I swear to God, I did not know he was stealing from your medical funds. He handled all the banking. He told me his private investments were generating massive returns and that the company was thriving under his incredible leadership. He lied to me. Mom, he manipulated me into believing we were independently wealthy. I am a victim here. You cannot let Camille send me to prison. I am your daughter. I am your favorite. You have to protect me from this absolute nightmare. Jasmine crawled closer to the table, her shaking hands reaching out pleadingly toward the thick stacks of forensic accounting ledgers that detailed the theft of $3 million. She continued her hysterical theatrical performance, sobbing loudly and claiming that Bradley was a controlling financial abuser who forced her to sign corporate documents. She simply did not understand. She insisted that she was entirely innocent, an unwitting, naive pawn in his disgusting underground gambling addiction. She turned her tear-filled eyes toward me, begging me to show her mercy, begging me to call off the ruthless lawyers and the imposing private security team because she was completely terrified of losing her freedom and her luxurious lifestyle. She promised she would divorce Bradley immediately. She promised she would never speak to him again if we just let her walk away without filing any criminal charges. She completely threw the man she had called the absolute love of her life directly under the speeding bus, hoping his complete destruction would somehow serve as a shield to protect her own fragile freedom. The absolute staggering speed with which her profound marital loyalty vanished was a breathtaking masterclass in pure, unadulterated selfishness. There was absolutely no hesitation in her brutal betrayal. She was perfectly willing to watch Bradley rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life, as long as she could keep her country club membership and avoid wearing a horrible prison uniform. Bradley stopped retreating and suddenly planted his feet firmly on the polished marble floor, his hands dropping away from his defensive posture, the pathetic, cowering stance he had adopted when the forensic audit was first revealed, completely vanished. The polite, sophisticated country club facade he had worn for years, the charming fake smile he used to manipulate my father, and the polite, respectful voice he used at our family dinners, entirely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but a vicious, cornered, rat-facing total annihilation. "Oh, shut up, Jasmine." Bradley sneered, his voice, dripping with such profound, malicious contempt that it actually made Marcus flinch in the background. "You are not a victim, and you are certainly not innocent. You stupid, spoiled parasite. You knew exactly where the money was coming from when you demanded that $150,000 Porsche for your birthday. You knew my personal accounts were completely drained, but you threw a massive screaming tantrum in the driveway and told me to just pull the cash from this corporate emergency funds because your father was far too incompetent and blind to ever notice the missing money." Bradley took a heavy, aggressive step toward his weeping wife, pointing a shaking, furious finger down at her as she kneeled pathetically on the floor. He was actively sweating his face, contorted into an ugly mask of pure, hateful rage. "Do not dare kneel there and play the ignorant, naive housewife with me. You authorized half of those wire transfers yourself. You stood right behind me in the home office and watched me forge the secondary executive signatures because you absolutely needed those custom Cartier bags for your pathetic little social media posts. You knew the math did not make any sense. You knew a junior executive salary could not possibly fund private yacht excursions in the Mediterranean and flawless diamond tennis bracelets. But you completely ignored the reality because you are nothing but an empty, greedy shell of a human being who only cares about looking rich on the internet." The two of them erupted into a vicious, deafening, screaming match right in the center of the massive living room, completely ignoring the imposing presence of the private security team and the highly paid legal professionals observing their absolute destruction. Their perfect, highly curated marriage was instantly exposed as nothing more than a toxic, fraudulent transaction built entirely on a foundation of stolen money and profound mutual disgust. Jasmine screamed that Bradley was a pathetic, broke loser who ruined her entire life while Bradley roared back. That Jasmine was a shallow, talentless burden who drove him into massive gambling debts just to fund her endless, insatiable demands for luxury goods. They tore each other apart with ruthless, brutal precision, weaponizing every single private insecurity and secret resentment they had harbored throughout their entire fake marriage. Bradley laughed a dark, cruel laugh that echoed through the room, mocking Jasmine for believing she was actually a successful socialite. He revealed that all her wealthy friends secretly despised her and only tolerated her presence because she was always willing to pick up the expensive dinner tabs using my mother's stolen credit cards. He told her that her entire personality was a manufactured lie and that without the stolen generational wealth, she was completely worthless. Jasmine shrieked in absolute fury, scrambling to her feet and slapping him hard across the face, screaming that he was a con artist who manipulated his way into a wealthy family because he was too lazy and stupid to ever build a real career of his own. She yelled that he had used her father's blind, desperate need for a white corporate son-in-law to infiltrate the company and steal their legacy. Marcus stood completely paralyzed in the background, his eyes wide with horrified disbelief, watching his golden child and his perfect, flawless son-in-law viciously cannibalize one another. Their screaming voices echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion, a chaotic, terrifying symphony of absolute ruin. The very people who had united to destroy me and bleed my mother dry were now tearing each other to pieces, desperate to save their own miserable skins. Marcus looked like a man who had just watched his entire religion be proven false in a matter of seconds. The brilliant financial genius he had handed the keys to the kingdom was actually a degenerate gambling addict who openly mocked his intelligence, and the beautiful, perfect daughter he had placed on a golden pedestal was a willing accomplice in the systematic financial destruction of their family. Marcus tried to open his mouth to intervene, to somehow assert his non-existent authority over the screaming match, but the words died in his throat. He was completely powerless, stripped of his title, his money, and his profound delusions. I sat quietly in the executive chair at the center of the oak table, watching the spectacular ultimate payoff of my mother's revenge unfold before my eyes. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue or defend myself. The undeniable truth, sitting in the red forensic folders, had already done all the devastating work for me, ripping away their shiny protective masks and exposing the ugly, rotting core of their existence. My mother sat completely still beside me, her dark eyes locked onto the chaotic scene, her posture radiating absolute calm, validation. She had waited 35 years to see the truth brought to the light, and now it was burning so brightly it was blinding them. Thomas, the forensic accountant, and Gregory, the trust lawyer, watched the implosion with professional detachment, occasionally making quiet notes on their laptops, while the security guards remained perfectly still, ensuring the physical violence did not escalate beyond their contained mutual destruction. Glorious, satisfying reality was that I did not even have to destroy them. They were doing it entirely to themselves, fueled by the very greed and arrogance that had defined their entire miserable lives. The screaming match between Jasmine and Bradley eventually dissolved into exhausted, pathetic sobbing as the sheer reality of their doomed situation finally crushed whatever remaining energy they possessed. Marcus, who had been standing frozen like a hollow statue, suddenly seemed to snap back to reality. He looked at his crying daughter and his fraudulent son-in-law and realized that absolutely no one was coming to save him. His fake corporate empire was gone, his stolen wealth was frozen, and his absolute authority had been completely stripped away by the very women he had spent decades trying to destroy. He slowly turned his gaze away from the pathetic display on the floor and looked directly at my mother. The aggressive, demanding tone he had used just minutes ago completely vanished, replaced by a sickeningly sweet, desperate manipulation. He took a slow, hesitant step toward the center of the oak table, his hands held out in front of him like a beggar pleading for scraps. "Evelyn, please," he whispered, his voice cracking with a manufactured sorrow that made my skin crawl. "You cannot actually do this to me. To us. We have been married for 35 years. We built an entire life together. We raised 2 beautiful daughters. We shared a home and a bed and a lifetime of memories you cannot just throw away. Over 3 decades of marriage because of a misunderstanding and some financial mistakes made by a reckless son-in-law." Marcus took another step forward, his knees suddenly buckling beneath him as he physically dropped to the floor right in front of my mother's high-backed leather chair. It was the ultimate act of theatrical desperation. A man who had demanded absolute worship. His entire life was now groveling on the polished marble floor, staining his cheap Hawaiian souvenir shirt. With his own hypocritical tears, he reached his trembling hands out, attempting to grasp the hem of my mother-tailored navy blue suit. "Evelyn, I love you," he cried, looking up at her with red, puffy eyes. "I have always loved you. I know I have been a difficult man. Sometimes I know I have let my pride get the better of me, but I am your husband. I am the father of your children. You cannot just toss me out onto the street like a common criminal. I will change, Evelyn. I swear to you, I will be the husband you deserve. I will fix this mess, and we can go back to being the perfect family everyone respects. My mother did not flinch. She did not pull her leg away. She did not show a single ounce of sympathy or hesitation. She simply looked down at the pathetic groveling man at her feet, with eyes made of absolute solid ice. The sheer profound emptiness in her gaze was more terrifying than any screaming tantrum could ever be. She looked at him, not as a husband or a partner, but as a completely irrelevant stranger who had overstayed his welcome. "You left me to die for a dinner reservation," my mother said, her voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. "You watched me gasping for air on this very floor. You saw me clutching my chest and begging for help, and you stepped right over my body so you could go eat oysters and drink expensive champagne in Hawaii. You did not stay to hold my hand. You did not call an ambulance. You did not even bother to check if I had a pulse before you walked out that front door." Marcus opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse, but my mother held up a single manicured finger, silencing him instantly. The air in the room felt heavy and suffocating as she delivered her final absolute judgment. "There is no misunderstanding, Marcus. There are no memories worth saving. You spent 35 years bleeding my family legacy dry to feed your own massive, pathetic ego, and you threw me away the second I became an inconvenience to your luxury vacation." She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes piercing straight through his fraudulent soul. "You have exactly 30 minutes to walk upstairs and pack whatever belongings you purchased with your own personal money, which according to these financial audits is absolutely nothing. The security team will escort you out of my house, and if you ever try to contact me again, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a prison cell next to your precious son-in-law." The finality of her words hung in the silent room, severing the 3-5-year marriage with brutal, absolute precision. Marcus slumped forward on his knees, burying his face in his hands as the monumental weight of his total ruin finally crushed him completely. Jasmine was still crying softly on the floor, clutching her cheap plastic garbage bags, incapable of processing the fact that her father had just been permanently discarded. Bradley was leaning against the wall, staring blankly at the forensic, accounting ledgers, knowing his own fate was already sealed. But the spectacular consequences of my mother revenge were not quite finished. Before Marcus could even attempt to drag himself off the floor, a sudden bright flashing light pierced through the tall living room windows, sweeping across the dark walls in a rhythmic, terrifying pattern. Alternating flashes of harsh red and bright blue illuminated the perfectly manicured front lawn, casting long, frantic shadows through the glass. The sound of heavy tires crushing the gravel driveway echoed loudly through the silent mansion, followed by the unmistakable authoritative slamming of heavy vehicle doors. Bradley's face turned from pale to completely translucent. He scrambled backward away from the windows, his chest heaving with sudden violent panic. "What did you do?" he whispered, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I sat perfectly still in my executive chair, watching the front doors of the estate swing open. I did not just freeze the corporate banking accounts. "Bradley," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady, dropping the final anvil onto his shattered reality while you were busy trying to sell your wife designer handbags to a Hawaiian pawn shop. I handed the entire forensic audit, the forged corporate signatures, the offshore routing numbers, and the comprehensive proof of your illegal gambling transfers straight to the federal authorities. 4 uniformed police officers stepped into the grand foyer, accompanied by 2 plain-clad detectives wearing stern, unyielding expressions. They bypassed the private security team, who simply nodded and stepped aside to let them pass. As the lead detective walked straight into the center of the living room, his eyes sweeping over the pathetic group of sunburned criminals cowering on the marble floor. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and read the official arrest warrant aloud, calling out Bradley's full legal name. Bradley tried to run his survival instincts, overriding his common sense, but the unformed officers were completely prepared. They grabbed him violently by the shoulders, slamming him hard against the oak table right next to the red folders containing his financial crimes. They wrenched his arms behind his back, the sharp metallic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs echoing loudly through the room as they locked his wrists together tightly. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement," the detective announced, his voice cutting through the remaining tension in the room. You have the right to remain silent. Jasmine shrieked as the officers dragged her husband away from the table, watching the man she thought would fund her glamorous lifestyle, forever being treated like a common street criminal. She did not try to defend him. She did not reach out to hold his hand. She simply backed away against the wall, terrified that the police might suddenly decide to put her in handcuffs. 2. Marcus remained frozen on his knees, too broken and humiliated to even look at the authorities, as they marched his perfect golden son-in-law out the front door and shoved him into the back of a waiting police cruiser. The private security team stepped forward, moving with swift professional efficiency now that the police had cleared the room. The lead guard grabbed Marcus roughly by the arm, hauling the defeated patriarch off the floor and pointing him toward the front door. Another guard grabbed Jasmine by the shoulder, forcing her to pick up the cheap black plastic garbage bags holding her wrinkled clothes. They did not get 30 minutes to pack. They did not get to go upstairs to retrieve their toothbrushes or their shoes. The guards marched them straight out of the mansion, pushing them forcefully onto the cold, dark driveway. Marcus and Jasmine stumbled out onto the street, carrying their pathetic trash bags shivering in the freezing December wind. The flashing lights of the police cruisers had drawn the attention of the entire wealthy neighborhood. Dozens of affluent neighbors, elite country club members, and prominent local politicians were standing on their manicured lawns, watching in absolute shock as the fake king of Atlanta and his spoiled socialite daughter were permanently exiled from their stolen kingdom. Their ultimate humiliation was completely public and undeniable spectacle of total ruin. Inside the mansion, the heavy oak front doors were pulled shut by the security guards, the heavy deadbolts clicking into place with a satisfying finality. The red and blue lights faded away as the police cruisers drove out of the neighborhood, taking Bradley to a federal holding cell. The massive living room was suddenly incredibly quiet. The toxic, chaotic noise that had polluted this house for 35 years was finally and permanently gone. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension melt away from my shoulders. I walked over to the small, wet bar in the corner of the room and plugged in the electric kettle. The soft, comforting sound of bubbling water was the only noise in the quiet warmth of the house. I prepared 2 cups of chamomile tea, carefully carrying them over to where my mother was still sitting in the high-backed leather chair. I handed her the warm porcelain mug, and she took it with a gentle, grateful smile. We sat together in the sweet, peaceful silence, sipping our tea and watching the winter wind rustle the trees through the large glass windows. The air in the house felt remarkably clean, light, and completely free. The heavy, suffocating weight of Marcus' arrogance and Jasmine entitlement had been completely scrubbed from the walls. My mother leaned her head back against the chair, closing her eyes and letting out a quiet sigh of absolute contentment. We had burned their fake empire to the ground, and we had survived the fire completely unscathed. Blood might make you related, but loyalty makes you family. I have learned that the hard way, watching the people who were supposed to protect us choose their own selfish greed over our survival. Have you ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace and your sanity? Tell me your story in the comments below. And remember, your success and your happiness is the sweetest revenge you can ever achieve. Do not forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and truth. The greatest lesson from this story is that shared DNA does not give anyone the right to disrespect or exploit you. True family is built on loyalty, mutual respect, and unconditional love, not on manipulation or financial gain. When the people who are supposed to protect you choose their own selfishness over your well-being, you have every right to walk away. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-love and survival. You do not owe your peace of mind to toxic relatives. Reclaiming your own power and happiness is the ultimate victory. Please share your experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories.